Well, welcome, Jason Hill, to the ElevatePFS Revenue Cycle Insights podcast. We're so grateful for you to be joining us. You are currently the CEO of Global Services at Parallon, and I wanted to see if you could just share a little bit about that, that role. It's a pretty interesting one, but also give a little bit of background about your what you've done and how you got to the place you're in now.
Yeah, absolutely. Matt, great to see you again. Was flattered to hear when you invited me to participate on this podcast with you. I am with Parallon and am part of a newly formed formalized organization called the Global Shared Service Center, but have a long tenure with HCA Parallon going back to 2005 and have had the opportunity to participate in a number of leadership roles. And in some of those roles was able to interact with you in the workplace. And that's kind of where our relationship started off. And it's been great over the years to kind of stay in touch and to be part of this journey that I'm on with HCA Parallon. And so I will talk a little bit more about kind of that formalization of this new global organization, I think a little later in this podcast, but that's kind of what brings us to this.
It does. And I got a little bit of a surprise for you. So 4 years ago, just a little over 4 years ago, we were out on the Green River down by Flaming Gorge and doing some fishing down there. And one of my counterparts here, Matt Blackner, cast his line, and this fly right here went into your neck. This is the fly. You kept it.
That's the very one?
That's the very fly. We hooked you then. We've hooked you now. Well, a highlight for me, though, was inviting you to come out there. I think you caught the first, not the only fish, but it was the first fish on the river. And so it was a lot of fun and great for you that you were willing to come out and be guided by a bunch of guys who pretend to be fishermen.
That was such a great trip. And I had almost forgotten about the whole fly in the neck thing, but that happened. And I can't believe it was in 4 years. And I also can't believe you still have the very fly that did that.
Matt Fisher saved it. We've been meaning to mount it and send it to you. It's taken this long though to even show you that we still have it. So we'll get it to you and you can mount it proudly and somewhere in your office there. And it might be a reminder, a painful one, of your undying friendship.
I would love it.
I've been through a lot.
It'll be part of my background going forward for the next podcast.
So one of the more interesting things about you, so I've known you for some time, and I've been fortunate to work with you in different capacities, as you mentioned. And I've reached out to you on a number of occasions because I think of you as a thought leader who's kind of come about this in a different way than I have. I've been almost exclusively on the vendor side of the work that we do. And I know that you had a stint where you did some consulting work, but outside of that, it's almost been exclusively on the provider side. Although I think Parallon, there's a interesting dynamic there between Parallon and HCA, of course. But before all that, you were raised in a household, and this, I would like to understand people's why, their motivation, what drives them. And because, of course, outside of the office, we all have lives that we live. And I wanted to hear a little bit about your upbringing and how that has affected the way you've approached this work, the way you see what you do, how you compartmentalize maybe work with the other roles, the other hats you wear and the other roles you have.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just a little bit about me personally. I grew up in Oklahoma, spent my childhood between there and Dallas. My dad was a pastor. And so we moved a number of different places as he took different churches over the years. So I lived in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Dallas, Texas, Minneapolis, Minnesota for a period of time, and Louisville, Kentucky. I had 3 children. They're all adulting at this point, living in the Nashville area. I live in Tampa, current state, and my children are between Nashville and they've studied abroad some. And I have my youngest. I have one left in school, and she is going to Samford in Birmingham, her last year. She's going into her senior year. My plan, though, is to move to Nashville within the next couple of weeks. I'm positioning to do that, moving out of my Tampa property and recently bought a home in Nashville. So looking forward to becoming a Nashvilleian again, having a much stronger on-site presence here in the office, and also being able to be closer to my children. So that,
And that has to do with your transition from the Tampa shared service organization, correct, to this new role?
it does. Yeah, you mentioned me being on the provider side and also having some vendor or consulting experience. That's really kind of where I started, was in the consulting arm of what was EY, Ernst & Young, and then became Capgemini, Ernst & Young. I was on revenue cycle engagements kind of by chance. I established a networking connection with a revenue cycle partner within the firm. And so he was able to pull me on a number of different engagements, including but not limited to the Detroit Medical Center and Johns Hopkins. So spent some time kind of moving around a longer term engagements that happened to be revenue cycle engagements. Eventually had the opportunity to step on to an HCA engagement here in Nashville. And that would have been 1999, kind of where that journey started. And being able to work and partner with HCA on a number of different initiatives over the course of 5 years really started to identify with the culture within HCA and the mission and the purpose. And I think what impressed me most was where, as a consultant, I was part of meetings that I would hear people say, okay, I get the business case, I get the finance associated with what we're doing, but what's the right thing to do? And then I would see us take action on what the right thing to do was. And I liked that. And it became very contagious to me, and eventually decided to kind of cross that bridge from being consultant to actually being part of the organization. And I did that in 2005. Kind of rounding back to your initial question, though, about my childhood and kind of where I come from and how that shaped, I guess, the way I navigate things now and how that might have shaped my leadership style. A lot of that, I guess I attribute it to two key figureheads in my life. One was my dad, who, as I mentioned before, was a pastor. And the other was a mentor who happened to be my CEO when I joined the organization, formerly HCA Parallon, and is my mentor even today, even though he's retired. And so I guess I'll speak to it from those two angles, what my dad kind of brought to the equation for me, and then what the mentor brought to the equation for me. My father, I would say two key things as I was kind of thinking about and preparing for our conversation today. One was humility and the value of that, and the absolute necessity of that. That carries over into what has become quite somewhat of a buzzword, servant leadership. But watching, not necessarily sitting under the pulpit and listening my dad drive home hellfire and brimstone humility, but really being able to step back and watch my father and who he related to and how he related to them, and how it really, there was no division in terms of role or status in society or any of that. It was, he really approached people where they were, who they were, and recognized kind of that humanity within each person. And so that has helped shape how I interact and communicate and relate to folks within the workplace and outside of the workplace. So very much appreciate him for that. The other thing that I would say my dad brought to the table that I use to kind of govern how I approach things daily, and it's a constant work in progress, and sometimes even I would call it a battle, and that is, he would always say, we create images. We create images of how other people are thinking, what other people's opinions are, how people receive us. And he said most, if not all of the time, those images are not representative of reality. So in other words, I may meet with someone on a workplace issue. I may walk away from that meeting and I will build images about what happened in that meeting, how people feel about how I represented in that meeting. And those images can lead to stress. Those images can lead to actions, but those images are just images. And often they don't reflect the reality of the situation. It's the humanity in us that builds those images. So I try to stay cognizant of that And as I'm starting to spin on something, realize that, wait a second, is this reality? Or is this truly an image that I have built in my mind mentally that may or may not represent that reality?
And just a little bit on that. So, I mean, that is a conscious effort you make to be aware that your perception, you're projecting, right? I'm not sure what the latest psychological or therapy terms are, but you are, yeah, like your dad would say, I guess, create those images of somebody, and then to combat that, you just try and eliminate that and let the reality of the situation dictate your view, as opposed to letting your own biases or your own perspectives shape things. Is that the approach you take?
It does. It serves as kind of a check for me, a check and balance. That if let's say I'm building a stress level about an interaction that just happened, and I'm feeling a certain way about it, it's a check mentally to say, wait a second, is what's causing you churn image that you built, or is it reality? And it helps me think through that, evaluate it, triage it, so that I can take action on something that may be closer to reality than just on the image I built in my head, if that makes sense.
And is that something you applied not just to the people, but I imagine the situations, right? Like the actual scenarios you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, making sure that you're grounded in the truth of the situation rather than your or someone else's perception, right?
Absolutely. And perception is a good word. I mean, I use image and perception kind of synonymously. And it's that perception. I walked away with a certain perception of what happened. That person walked away with a perception of what happened. I can't necessarily build a perception for how they walked away from that. I can assume it, but there's things that I can do to validate that. And action should be really based on what I validate as reality about that encounter or that interaction.
So that was your dad. You said there's a couple things there, that the humility and then that the images. What about the other mentor you mentioned? I didn't catch his name. I don't know if you've said it yet, but
yeah, his name was Rick Baker. He was actually my CEO at the Nashville Shared Service Center.
oh, okay.
He has some really strong convictions about certain things in terms of how he approached the world and how he approached others. And he was also really big on humility. And again, not one to just talk about it and preach it, but one to show it. And things I noticed, little small things, like a lot of times a CEO of an organization is going to demand or expect that they have a parking place up front, oftentimes with a sign that says this is reserved for CEO. And I would sit back and watch Rick park on the entire back end of the parking lot and walk through the lot to get to the building. And you know what? That's may not be a big deal to some people, and a lot of people may not have even noticed that, but I did. And I noticed how he practiced servant leadership through even little things like that. So just kind of reinforcing that whole being humble as a leader and checking yourself on that routinely so that you maintain that stance.
On that, Jason, real quick, how do you guard against performance? Right, kind of the like, I mean, going back to perception, right, of the thing versus the reality. So someone who is projecting, but in their own private, when no one's looking, right. So how do you guard against that kind of that tug and pull there between that how you want to project yourself and how other people are perceiving you?
Yeah. Some of that right there, I think, falls back to how genuine you are. If you're doing it to just show that you're trying to be able in a team or organization versus truly, genuinely possessing that as part of your character, I think people see that, they feel it, they sniff it out, and it shows through.
Something that people sometimes struggle with, right? I mean, you see it all the time in the news where people create a certain image of themselves for the world, but in reality, their hearts are removed from that. Like you say, that genuineness, that authenticity is so valuable, especially in an era of AI and deep fakes and all the things we see, right? That authenticity is a real currency.
It's becoming a very scarce resource now.
Yeah. So Rick Baker, so humility, a similar theme with your dad then on humility. there as well. So seeing that though, and maybe in the workplace was pretty impactful to see someone who's doing this type of work. I mean, because you expect it, right? In kind of the pastor world, it's kind of what you expect to see and hear, but maybe not so much in the professional one.
Absolutely. It has a place.
Parallon has a pretty famous leadership development program that you are part of and a beneficiary of. Tell us a little bit about that and how you got involved in that program and how that's benefited you. And is that something that's still in practice with Parallon? Are they still using that tool and to help grow their awesome leaders?
It very much is. At a assistant COO level is kind of where I stepped into the program. It was brand new. So it was me and a partner assistant COO that kind of pioneered that program with the company. Hugely beneficial, gave me the opportunity and kind of the bandwidth in which to grow into a role before I was slammed into it. Not always a luxury that we have in roles that we stepped into. So feel like that program from a succession and bench perspective is so huge to ensure that our leaders are a known quantity and that they do have the opportunity to grow under some really solid mentorship before they actually step into a role. It's a win for the individual. It's a win for the organization.
So how do you tell me a little bit about that, Jason? Because that's obviously a big expense. That's a huge cost to Parallon to spend that money on in some ways a duplicate leader. Correct? I mean, that person who's in that kind of co or assistant role, they're in some ways duplicating the role. So it's an added cost. So how do you make the case to Parallon that it's worth it, right? What are the markers you're looking for to say, hey, because obviously to some extent, I'm sure they're looking at it from a dollars and cents perspective, right? How do you measure that it's been successful and that's helped lead Parallon in the right direction?
Absolutely. Without a doubt, it's an investment. And it is an investment that Parallon has chosen to make. And the yield has been there because if you're selective. So I would say that is key to a succession program like that, is making sure that you are truly grooming the talent that has the potential to be what you want them to be. I feel like Parallon has struck a really nice balance with being able to identify and zero in on that potential that they're grooming, and then not for it to be just an incremental add from a cost perspective, but to really turn that resource while they're being groomed into a value add. So for example, when I was serving as assistant COO under the COO, whether it was a new initiative or part of her scope, it wasn't just a duplicity in a grooming capacity. She was giving me operational scope. I had departments that I owned and managed throughout that process and rotation. And those departments changed over time to really build out that rotation and that foundation. But without it, I feel like there would have been some offsetting cost as I kind of tried to grow into that and learn and understand the areas. I was able to step in a role when she moved to corporate, and I had already pretty much experienced ownership of the scope that I was stepping into, and had many exposure opportunities that helped just catapult me into a very productive type capacity as opposed to a ramp up capacity. So
is it fair to say that part of the yield you see is that rather than there being kind of these dips and peaks with your leadership team, a dip when they've come in, right, and they're growing and growing, and then they peak out and they move on, and then you get another dip when a new person comes in, you flatline that essentially and kept that more consistent so you have more. Is that one of the major payoffs with that kind of a program that you found?
When you think about it from a cost perspective, absolutely. You're smoothing, right? So you're putting an investment up front that helps offset the risk of cost on the back end when you run a vacancy while you're trying to find someone. And then when you try to find the right leader, then they're in a ramp phase. And there's cost associated with all of that. By focusing that cost up front, you are kind of negating some of those back end costs that you would otherwise incur.
So I want to talk a minute about your current role, though, because this is pretty unique. I'm not sure that there are many organizations, healthcare organizations in the country that even have the option for an overseas, they don't have an overseas footprint to begin with. There's a few I can think of, but not many. And so this is a new role, correct? This is a new role that you're stepping into. So tell us a little about that role, what it is, and what your focus has been there, because it's a pretty interesting to get outside of the country in the healthcare world and still be in healthcare in the US.
Yeah, it is interesting. And for me personally, it has become such a win because when I was an undergrad, I knew I wanted to I had this draw towards healthcare, but I didn't think I wanted to be clinical. So I knew that wasn't the path, but healthcare was something I wanted to be involved in, and I believed in that mission part of it. But I also wanted to be part of an international business type setting, and would have those conversations with Ernst & Young when I was part of that organization, or very early on. And they were almost like mutually exclusive, like US healthcare international just really didn't do that. And so this opportunity has been able to give me the ability to finally marry those two things and have a healthcare flavor, still US based to some extent, and then be able to fold in the global piece of that. So super exciting personally. From an organizational perspective, we're not in any way new to the global arena and leveraging business partners to help supplement our business. The new piece of it is that where historically we've been more service line driven, and every service line that participates globally within Parallon has kind of been somewhat encapsulated in the way that they approach that business. We've stepped back and said, hey, we want to approach this at an enterprise level and from an enterprise perspective. And so that's why we formalize kind of a global entity within Parallon to come at all things, whether it's contracting, whether it's expectation management, relationships, accountability, all those things that go into a partnership, we're able to approach from an enterprise level. And that's where I've had the opportunity to step in, build a team to do just that.
So what are the objectives of the global shared, that group? What are you trying to accomplish for Parallon in that role exactly?
Coming at it from an enterprise level allows us to achieve efficiencies that we didn't have back in more of a siloed approach. So that's a key piece of it. Objectives, I would say tactically, is to be able to leverage the support of global business partners to supplement our business and help us address needs that aren't sometimes as easily to address domestically, whether that is monitoring work overnight or being super nimble as it relates to volume fluctuations and being able to quickly react to that. But by supplementing our business with kind of that global aspect, we're able to do that and do that more efficiently, I would say, from a cost perspective.
So you've been overseas a bit now. And how long ago did this role start? How long have you been in this role now?
So it was progressive, but it became official in the January, February timeframe. So early this year. So we're about half a year into it.
So have you had any experiences overseas were surprising or maybe unexpected in terms of the experience of doing this work in a different environment?
I don't know that there's been anything super surprising. I'm very much an adventure adrenaline guy. And so even before taking this role, I, for example, a couple of summers ago, bought a plane ticket to Vietnam without a plan, showed up and just figured out how to walk through the country basically over the course of a couple of weeks. So love kind of that adrenaline.
It's a swimsuit and a passport.
There you go, man. I historically, I've always been such a planner and I wanted everything just right and all of this. And I'm at a point in life that I get adrenaline now out of showing up and like, okay, I'm here now. What? There's something really cool about that. So having that kind of adventure addiction, I would say, this role has made a lot of sense because it allows me not to just do that in my personal life, but to experience some things in my professional life as well. So if there's anything surprising, I would say, and pleasantly surprising, it has been to have the exposure and visibility to the cultural differences and how that flows into the workplace. So, for example, in our U.S. healthcare industry world, this is a generality, but we might come at things to say, I have to go to work. I have to get up at 7. I have to do this. I have to do that. And there, in many of these global settings, you see very qualified individuals, multilingual individuals that approach it very differently. It's not a have to, it's a get to. And you see that conveyed in the pride in what they do and the energy that they come at it and in their tone. And I would say that has been the most pleasantly surprising thing that I've experienced as I've been able to work with various partners across the globe is just that perception of the get to versus the have to.
Yeah, gratitude, right? I mean, going along with those other virtues you were talking about earlier with humility, gratitude, I think is such a powerful thing to implement in your professional setting. So would you say that'd be the one thing if you could adopt a practice or a approach or a culture from your experience overseas and bring it to your teams here that are U.S. based, would that be the quality you bring, or are there other things you'd bring over and say, man, they've really got this down. I'd love to see more of this here in the U.S.
I would say that's probably it, because honestly, I don't know that I see that certain teams or countries or cities do things better. I would say maybe they do things different, but that perception difference is key. And yes, to your question, I would love to bring that over and infuse it. And to some extent, I think we can with the way that we approach our teams and the way we approach communication and trust, and all of that goes into it. But I do think there's a cultural aspect that feeds into it as well. And that one's a bit more challenging to tackle.
You've got a pretty unique perspective given this role. When you look at the landscape of our industry, and I'm asking you to be a Punxsutawney Phil here and do some prognostication, but when you look at our landscape and what's coming, I mean, obviously AI and is going to be a huge advent as its adoption rate increases, right? And gets infused more. But what are the things that you feel like are going to be the most disruptive in our space? What do you see coming that we need to be mindful of and preparing for?
Yeah, that's a really good and insightful question. AI for sure. I mean, that we all know that, right? I think aside from AI though, the most disruptive thing as I step back and look ahead is just going to be the shakeup with how consumers expect their care to be delivered. And that looks very different than it's looked in times past, and looks going to look very different. So a couple of things. One is the consumer being able to dictate and have control over where they get their care, how they get their care, and what that looks like. Believe it's going to be progressively more decentralized. And I see our consumer expectations really shifting away from, hey, I'm confused. I've got hospital bills. I've got anesthesia bills. I've got physician bills, and I don't know who's what. I've just got all these pieces and parts that I owe and don't really understand. I think we're going to, as a U.S. industry, healthcare, going to have to shift away from that consumer experience to one that is more custom to that consumer and less confusing and less fragmented.
Have you seen examples of that out there? Are there areas where you see that more tailored approach being enacted?
I do. I see it in my own personal health experience. I see being able to have more control over when and how I provide credentials and paperwork or digital type paperwork to prepare for a health encounter, being able to have more authority as a consumer on when I schedule and how I schedule and what those options are in terms of the modality in which I get that. being able to decide, do I want to get this from an urgent care? Do I want to go to a hospital? Do I want to go to a freestanding ED? Or do I want to do telehealth? And what are my options there, and what are the trade-offs? So those are where I'm already seeing personally as a healthcare consumer, that type of defragmentation and more options and ability to select how I want my care to be provided.
The healthcare, our industry is kind of, I would say, notoriously slow to adopt new approaches, new changes. And I know we're approaching at a time. What do you think the biggest impediments are for healthcare providers, for organizations to adopt approaches, techniques, tools that are being used elsewhere in the consumer market, right? Because I think one of the things that's driving what you're talking about is the fact that your consumers of healthcare are having a totally different experience, maybe with Amazon or whoever it is, and that is dictating to them, conditioning them to a certain expectation, right, in terms of their healthcare. And so when they come into healthcare and they see it's different, it feels archaic, it feels like it's behind. So what do you think in your opinion, what are the big impediments that these organizations have in terms of adopting these more forward-thinking approaches?
I think part of it is stepping out of just our lane and realizing we have to build partnerships and collaboration with perhaps entities that bring that to the table that may not even be healthcare type entities, and starting to blur those lines of, I'm an absolute healthcare organization and I'm an absolute Amazon provider, and really not blending the boundary between those two. I'm starting to see some of that happen with partnerships, but I think that's going to be required, because I don't know that within kind of our legacy healthcare mindset that we're capable, at least in the short term, perhaps as an industry, of thinking outside of the box enough without leveraging what might already exist in a non-healthcare partnership.
Well, I know we're out of time, Jason, but I wanted to thank you so much for spending it with us and sharing your thoughts and insights and your perspective and some of your story and how you got to where you're at. It's been really great. Of course, I value every minute I get to spend with you, and this time's no different. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast and being willing to change the lives of anyone who watches it. So looking forward to it.
It was my pleasure to be a part. It was great to catch up with you. Thanks again for having me. I enjoyed it. It was fun.